Today our guest is Mark Crispin Miller. Mark is a professor of media, culture and communication at the New York University, and he's also the author of several books. And today he has joined us to discuss propaganda. As we're being flooded by a whole new wave of propaganda, he will help us kind of like, how can we make sense of the media landscape? So welcome, Mark. Thank you for being here tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be talking to you again in this forum or a similar forum.
It's equal. So I'll start with a very simple question. What is propaganda?
It's a good question. I have my own very simple definition. I mean, if one wants a much more extensive and nuanced definition, I recommend Jacques Ellul's classic book, Propaganda, which came out in the 60s. Mm-hmm. I'm going to offer a much simpler definition, which is any organized attempt to get large numbers of people to think or do something, or not think something or do something. It isn't necessarily false. Propaganda need not be deceptive. It's important to make that point because when the word became widely used during World War I and since, it was a synonym for lying, because the Allied governments always used it to refer to anything that came out of Germany, any statement that came out of Germany during that conflict. They would call it propaganda. The presumption being that their own, that is the British and the American sides of the story, were factual, were true, were information, but anything that came out of Germany was propaganda. The word is actually much older than that. It was coined by the Vatican in the early 17th century. But we don't have to get into that. The fact is, it was not in wide use until World War I and after, at which point it was used, as it is still used, as a synonym for falsehood. It need not necessarily be false, but it usually is. And of course, the propaganda that most concerns us now, and that should concern everyone now, is not just false, but dangerously false.
Exactly. So how can you identify propaganda?
Well, that's actually not so easy, because, and I believe we discussed this particular point the last time we spoke. No one has a hard time recognizing the propaganda that he or she disagrees with, right? So if something comes out of the other camp, out of the other side, you will say, well, that's propaganda. Liberals will say, well, Fox News, that's propaganda. And alternatively, people on the right will look at the New York Times and say that's propaganda, and they'll both be right, but neither of them capable of taking the crucial step, which is to recognize the propaganda that pushes their own buttons, you see? So how does one recognize it, right? How do we answer your question, which is all important? That's an all important question. In order to recognize propaganda, you have to make a very deliberate and sustained effort to try to be as impartial as possible, to try to keep your head. And recognize the possibility that any story that is inescapable, it's everywhere you look, it's on every front page, it's at the top of every hour on TV, it's being blasted at us online, it's on the radio, etc. You can't get away from it. It is extremely unlikely that any such story became all pervasive in that way just by chance, just because it's a great story and all these media outlets thought, wow, this is something people need to know. I think you can safely assume that any story like that is propaganda, and therefore that it's probably a good idea to look specifically at those alternative arguments or voices that are routinely slandered in the in the main narrative, right? I almost said the mainstream media. I don't like the word mainstream because it's becoming increasingly clear that CNN and the Times and all the rest of them are actually quite eccentric, and even that they actually don't have very big followings. They have rather small followings. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around that. I'm sorry, what?
They have a lot of money. There's a lot of financial backing.
They have a lot of money and they have a lot of state support, right? So they cast a very long shadow. Their image is formidable. It's like the Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is this thunderous, intimidating head that's floating in the air. It has this deep voice that echoes, and it turns out to be this little guy behind the curtain working the controls. That's what the media is like now, really. I mean, it used to have a large following, a big viewership, readership, etc., but they don't anymore. They're actually quite small. But at any rate, any story like that that is omnipresent and inescapable, and that attacks alternative points of view, I am confident in saying that that is propaganda, or at least that one should understand the high likelihood that that is propaganda, and then be duly skeptical of its claims and check its claims. For God's sake, if it's telling you to get a booster or to have your child injected, don't do it just because it's all over the place, just because you hear that everywhere, just because celebrities are saying it and the president is saying it. Don't do it. Do the responsible thing for yourself and or for your child, and do as much research as possible. And that necessarily means, again, paying attention to precisely those experts who are vilified in the dominant narrative. See what it is that Dr. Mike Yeadon has to say, or Dr. Zelenko has to say, or Dr. Malone, or Dr. McCullough, or what they're saying at Children's Health Defense, a UK column. I could go on because there really are a lot of sites, places, people who have been working heroically to counter this vast, overwhelming, deceptive and dangerous narrative with some truth, with some science. It's a word people love to use without understanding what science is. So that's the first thing I would say is, if it's everywhere you look, if it's on every page you read, if everybody you know is repeating it, right? There's a high likelihood that it is propaganda, and therefore you are obliged to be responsible, be self-sufficient, keep your head, and just take a look to see if what they're claiming is true or not. And then you need to take a look at who is supporting, who or what is supporting all those outlets, supporting all those voices, right? And invariably, when you're dealing with the media, you find that it's big pharma. It's brought to you by Pfizer, and you find that the Gates Foundation has paid out to date something like $320 million to its strategic media partners, right? Which is news reported only here and there on the margins, but it is true, And he who pays the piper calls the tune. This has been true since the rise of the commercial press in the middle of the 19th century, and it's still true, right? And then beyond that economic fact, there's also the political fact that the media is answerable not just to those advertisers who maintain it financially, and not just to its corporate owners, right? But also to what people call the deep state, that the major media, the corporate media, and the so-called left press as well. It's important to note, all in one way or another follow a script that's drafted by I guess the CIA probably, because of all the agencies in the U.S., that have the biggest impact on the press. The CIA is outstanding. But the CDC also has an extremely well-funded and very slick press relations operation, as does the Pentagon. So it isn't just, an economistic answer that restricts itself only to the advertisers and the owners is not telling the whole story. That there are very, very powerful state and corporate interests that maintain the machine that is constantly blasting this illusion at us, right? And deluding us in a very destructive way.
Well, you mentioned the Bill Gates investments, because I remember reading that article, and the author that had tracked all these investments, he said it's possible to study, to do your journalism study with a Gates-funded scholarship, to do your internship at a Gates-funded publication, and then work at the Gates-funded publication, but also have your journalistic association be also, again, receiving funding from Bill Gates. And then he said, well, everything that I tracked was not just the publication and the associations and the education, but the things that weren't in those like 300+ million were that he funds research. So the research is being published in scientific journals. He funds scientific journals. So these scientific articles, again, they are being fed into the news media again. So there are even steps behind that where he is influencing the narratives that are being pushed. So it's not so if you talk about like the big media bubble, it's not even just the press. It's even broader than that.
Oh, absolutely. That's absolutely true. We're talking about, the maintenance, the establishment and the maintenance of so potent a narrative is the result of far more labor than simply dictating what media outlets say. That's absolutely true. Gates does indeed, in part, control the research agenda of doctors and scientists, as does his partner, Tony Fauci, who basically controls through his agency funding for drug trials and medical research across the board. Bobby Kennedy's new book, The Real Anthony Fauci, goes into great detail about this.
Yes.
So we're therefore talking not just about the media, as you note, but also academia. The universities are heavily, heavily dependent on the same kind of money. If it isn't Gates, and if it isn't the NIH, then it's Pfizer, or it's Merck, and so on. So the universities have been profoundly corrupted by all this. Now let's move away from COVID for the moment and mention another dominant narrative that is also continuing, and that will also probably be exploited in the same way that the virus was exploited, and that's climate change, right? Which is something I used to believe in. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I saw An Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore, and I bought it hook, line, and sinker, and I was very worried about the planet. I've always
I used to be a sustainability consultant.
Sustainability, there we go. So I don't have to tell you what sustainability really means. I've always considered myself kind of an environmentalist, but that actually has to do with air pollution, water pollution, the runoff of chemical fertilizers, radiation, glyphosate. These are genuine environmental threats. The climate change narrative really doesn't have anything to do with any of those. It's just about the inexorable rise of global temperature due to human activity. So I'm saying I bought that, right? So an important theme or sub-theme of our conversation is that I don't sit here posing as someone who has never been taken in and who has always seen through these things and is trying to get all the ignoramuses who are listening to you to understand that, you know, I know better than they do. I don't, and I haven't, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so you talk to anybody about climate change, and invariably, if you dissent from the dominant narrative, they will often become very angry, right? And
Mm-hmm.
indignant, and say that you're working for the fossil fuel industry and all this other stuff. Well, and then they'll say, you know, every climate scientist thinks X. You know, talk to any climate scientist, and they'll say, well, sure. Just as you talk to most doctors, pediatricians about vaccination, and they're going to say the same thing because they know which side of their bread is buttered. And I don't mean to suggest that they are knowingly lying. You know, when you are actually dependent on a certain kind of funding, you're going to end up thinking what it's convenient for you to think and believe in it too, because you don't want to face the likelihood or even the remote possibility that what you're doing is wrong and destructive, right? Well, climate
Well,
science, yeah,
mm-hmm.
go ahead.
For me, both those topics that you mentioned, what I noticed is they are very closed information systems. When you're in there, when you believe their assumptions, then it has an internal logic that's
Right.
very difficult to refute. And for both of them, I had been looking for other evidence or information, and I wasn't able to find it. But then at some point, with climate change, it was actually somebody sent me a list of scientists who signed a petition who disagreed with the science. And I thought, I never heard of this. Like, I'm working in this topic for over 12 years or something. Why didn't I ever hear about this? And then I started following these people, and I thought, I even, like, from the point of science, I was not able to judge it because it's very complex matter. I don't really understand those models, but I did notice that the people that were disagreeing, their characters got assassinated. They lost their, even if they have a tenured position, they would lose it.
That's
So,
right.
and I noticed that it wasn't allowed to ask questions about it. So those were my big red flags, actually,
Well,
on
yeah,
those narratives. Yeah.
absolutely. Now, you know, in order to answer the original question,
Sorry.
no, that's okay. You've actually helped make the point even more compelling. That when a whole body of academic practice is funded by the same sources to the same end, they're all going to sing the same song. You know, they're going to follow the same. They're going to be on the same page of the hymnal. You know,
Mhm.
climate scientists are in that category, as are many, if not most, virologists. In both cases, it is in their interest to think a certain thing, and it's kind of unreasonable to expect them to instantly, you know, take a serious look at claims that would demolish the very foundation of what they do. Not to say their employment, you know. So, and you know, that's the case with climate scientists. I mean, astrophysicists look at the same data and they interpret it very differently. And that's what science is, you know. Science is all about disagreement and
No,
argument.
it's about consensus, don't you know?
It's whatever Dr. Fauci says is the science, right? Which is just an authoritarian
Yeah.
delusion. In my case, you know, having been very concerned about cars idling at stoplights, and you know, as a student of propaganda, I was quite struck to discover that the main memes used to drive that narrative home, the propaganda used to drive it home, was all dubious, if not demonstrably false. And the first one was the famous hockey stick graph, right?
Mhm.
Which shows the Earth's median temperature completely consistent for centuries, you know, and then all of a sudden in the 20th century, it just peaks. Okay. Now, that has actually been debunked by a number of mathematicians at MIT and Japan and so on. I'm not expert at math. I was impressed by the credentials of those who are arguing against it. But you don't need an MA in math to realize there's something significant when the lead scientist of the team responsible for that graph, which the UN had adopted, and on the basis of which the UN was now making policy, okay? You didn't need a degree in math to be struck by the fact that that scientist, Michael Mann, when challenged in court, could not produce the raw data behind the graph. He could not or would not produce it. Well, that's extremely suspicious, and that is antithetical to standard scientific practice. If he's not going to reveal his data, it means that he's misinterpreted the data, or there is no data, right? Then it turns out that, and this speaks to a point you made a moment ago, the woman who is widely regarded as the world expert on polar bears, I think her name is something like Anne Crockford. I may have the last name wrong. She came out with a book on the how the polar bears are doing, and it was very upbeat. You know, the good news is, according to her, that the polar bears are actually flourishing. Now, this completely contradicts all those this kind of pathetic images of polar bears looking hungry and stranded on chunks of ice and stuff like that. But they're actually doing quite well. All right. Not only did she come out with that book, which is replete with evidence to back her claim, but she also quickly lost her job as an adjunct professor, I think somewhere in Canada, okay? And a third example, and this happened only weeks ago, is that an academic named Paul Ridd in Australia I think he was fired for unprofessional conduct by his university for criticizing the research of a colleague, research having to do with the relationship between the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef and climate change. He sued the university for wrongful termination, and Australia's High Court, unsurprisingly at this point, ruled against him recently. But that's very telling, okay? You mentioned character assassination, okay? That's absolutely true. Those of us who counter the dominant narrative, we are not debunked. They use the word debunk. We're not debunked. Debunking means that you have marshaled a powerful argument against one's claims, you know, using evidence and demonstrating that one was wrong. No, that's not what they do. They can't do that, okay? They can't do that with people like Dr. Zelenko, McCullough, Malone, etc. They can't do that with Bobby Kennedy's book. I like to think they can't do that with me. They can't do that with you. So what do? Well, they jeer, they mock, they move on from ridicule to a kind of hysterical denunciation by associating you with the Nazis. They call you a conspiracy theorist. All this is smoke, okay? All this is actually a tacit admission that you are right, okay? Because if they call you a conspiracy theorist, their aim is not to invite people to consider what you're saying, you know, and then understand that it's wrong. No, their aim is to try to persuade people not to pay any attention to what you're saying. It's a huge distraction. So when they call us conspiracy theorists, they have clearly already lost the argument. See? So I guess this is a second, not rule, but advisement I would offer on you know, recognizing propaganda. You must, you know, as if instinctively question the narrative that's all over the place, and you must look specifically at those people, those outlets that are telling a very different story. And then more specifically, you have to examine how those dissidents are treated. You will find that they are subjected to slanderous attack, you know, which often becomes violent, you know. I mean, I've spoken to some of the doctors who have come under fire. and they some of them have had to hire security. One of them has bought a gun. You know, that this is very serious stuff we're talking about. So if you want to understand propaganda, you have to take a close look at how the dissidents are attacked. You will find, I can't think of any exceptions. You will find, you know, no actual rational counterargument. Instead, you will find a lot of vicious ad hominem abuse, and that, you know, basically proves that that the position they stand for is a lie.
But it seems to be working, because even with your first what you started with, that it's like one message, there's no other message, and you're not allowed to look at anything else. But I noticed that like people who are reading the Andere Krant, they already want to know like what are other perspectives that we can look at. But if I think about people in my neighborhood, they wanna go to the standard media, and they want them to tell them what reality is, and they
Right.
want to trust that. Because I remember like talking to a neighbor recently, and she I was telling things, and she like about, it was about PCR test, I think, and I sent her something, and she said, yes, but why are they using this test if it doesn't work? And then it gets a little bit scary. And then she said, well, I have to read in the regular newspaper what they say about this.
Of course.
So it's kind of like because it's one message all the time, like it's very like if the people who are very hypnotized by it, they are not open to considering even a different message, and also the kind of the scapegoating. It works very well. So how do these people, like these really hypnotized people, how do you break their propaganda spell?
Well, you're in Amsterdam, right?
Deventer.
Is
Yeah,
that
but
here?
it's Netherlands. Yeah, Netherlands.
It's
Yeah.
liberal, educated.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm in New York
It's
City. Yeah. I mean, it actually is. It is working quite well in those places. I was
Mm-hmm.
going to say in those blue bubbles. I don't think you have the red blue thing in the Netherlands. But
Yeah,
if
but we have woke and people who are not so on
okay,
that bandwagon. Yeah.
all right. Well, let's just say in these blue bubbles it works, and it is striking how readily educated people, in particular, fall for this. But if we pull back and look more globally at what's happening, I think we discover that the so-called resistance to, or the opposition to this narrative, the refusal to believe it, is becoming ever more widespread. And this is, you know, this is what happens tragically. This is what has to happen, is that one finds that one's own experience and what one sees with one's own senses, I don't mean on TV, but I mean in the world around oneself, is radically at odds with what those voices from the media machine are saying.
Mm-hmm.
When you have that kind, when you come to that kind of realization, you know, when their claims are, in your experience, tragically contradicted by,
Mm-hmm.
say, the consequences of getting an injection, right? Um, that just tends to snap people out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Snaps them out of it. And I do think that while a lot of people in the blue world are dropping dead and so on post-vaccination, that is happening. It may be happening even more elsewhere. I mean, there's a lot of argument over, you know, whether batches of the so-called vaccine
Mm-hmm.
that are most toxic have been sent to red areas. I don't know what to think about that claim. It's in contention now. But the fact is that those who are most hypnotized even if they do collapse neurologically or lose somebody, you know, or are close to death, very often, frighteningly often, it will not shake their faith in the narrative. I mean, now people like that, Elze, there's nothing you can say, nothing. It's a waste of breath. You just say, you know, God bless you, good luck. You know, if you change your mind or you want to know more, don't hesitate to reach out to me. But there's no point in trying to talk to people who are completely enchanted, you know, completely, they're just under a spell, and you can't do anything about it. We have to keep doing what we're doing now in order to reach those who are newly awakened, to reach those who are open-minded to begin with, to reach younger people. That's essential, you know. And it's become an urgent matter as they're now attempting to inject young children, you know. I mean, they've really crossed a red line in doing that. But we are addressing an ever-growing population of those who have snapped out of it. You know, our numbers include people who have had one shot and suffered afterwards, people who had both shots and suffered afterwards, and even people who have had a booster and then suffered afterwards. You know, if you include all those people who are, you know, it can't be called anti-vaxxers, I think it's pretty obvious that we're actually in a kind of global majority. Although in you know, your town and in my city, which was once a great city and is no longer, it doesn't feel like, I mean, we really feel like we're in a tiny minority. And I'm at NYU, right? And at NYU, the faculty is overwhelmingly hypnotized by all this.
Are you
And
still allowed to go to the university?
yeah, well, yes, I am a tenured full professor. I don't want to take up 20 minutes to tell my story, but I came under attack.
I know, yeah. But you
Yeah.
can tell it because it relates to this media bubble explanation.
Okay. With your permission, then I will tell the story because there's some news about it that you know, what better venue to release that than yours? In September of 2020, in teaching my propaganda course, the first week, I was explaining to the students that our emphasis would be primarily on propaganda in real time. And so I was providing examples of the kinds of things we might study in the class and about which they might write their papers. And I noted, you know, look at the way we're meeting here today. We're meeting remotely, you know, we're on Zoom, you know, I hate it, you hate it. Why is it happening? Well, because of the COVID crisis. And this suggests that it may have something to do with successful propaganda, which I hastily explained doesn't necessarily mean it's false, but it's subject to critical study. I said, let's be more specific. One might study the mask mandates. And then I said, if we were to study the mask mandates, we would, first of all, read all the randomized controlled trials of masking in hospitals. I thought there were 8. There were actually more. All of which have found that masks do not prevent transmission of respiratory viruses. We would read all those studies. We would also read the more recent studies that have come out claiming to find otherwise, right? I gave a little advice on how non-scientists might assess new studies. There are things one can do. And that was that. And then one of the students in the class actually became enraged by this suggestion. She didn't say anything in the class or on Zoom, but she did go on Twitter a few days later and demand that NYU fire me, which was kind of startling, but it wasn't anywhere near as troubling as NYU's immediately taking her side, which is what happened. I think opportunistically. The department chair, my department chair, immediately thanked her on Twitter and assured her that the department was taking steps to basically honor her request, which was a complete shock to me because nobody had spoken to me. The other students in the class were contacted by the dean of my school and the doctor who determines COVID policy at NYU. They did not put me on copy. They, kind of muscled me out of the way. They elbowed me away from the lectern, as it were. And they told my students that I had given them, misinformation, and provided a list of links to the second category of studies that I had already suggested they read. But those bureaucrats basically told the students that these were the truth, whereas the whole point of the approach that I teach is you make up your own mind after a comprehensive review of all the pertinent evidence, okay? Then after that, I was told I couldn't teach the propaganda course the following semester. Okay. Now, what happened after that is even more dramatic. A month later, I was informed by the dean that at the request of my colleagues, he had ordered a review of my conduct because my colleagues claimed in a letter that he attached, they never showed it to me or spoke to me before writing it, that though they believe in academic freedom, of course, everybody believes in academic freedom, they note that according to the NYU faculty handbook, if a colleague's behavior is sufficiently heinous, it obviates, it nullifies his academic freedom. And they argued that that applied to me, that I had put the students at risk by telling them not to wear masks. Okay, I never said any such thing. And from there, they went on to accuse me of hate speech, attacks on students, aggressions and microaggressions. It was a kind of a social justice onslaught, and a COVID onslaught. And they also implied that I'm a conspiracy theorist, So it was this whole, this full-scale assault on my character with the intention of getting me terminated here. I went through their letter. I refuted it point by point. I asked for a retraction and an apology. They ignored me. I asked again. Second time, they ignored that. So I decided I had no choice but to sue them for libel, and not just because of me, but because what's happening to me is obviously happening all over the world. This speaks directly to the subject we're discussing. Many doctors, many scientists, some journalists, a few professors have been canceled, attacked, smeared, bullied, terminated. Sometimes have had their lives threatened, and this got to stop. So I decided I'm going to sue them for libel. I have a very strong case. All right, now I'll get to the news in this matter. Let me just say that the case, there are two strands to my story here. There's the case, and then there's the review of my conduct, okay? As to the case, my colleagues got a lawyer. They filed a motion to dismiss. They claimed that they had not lied about me. They claimed that they did not intend to have me fired, okay? These are both demonstrably false. All the documents in the case, let me add, are up on my website, markcrispinmiller.com, okay? So people can read whatever they want to read. In defense of their claim that they hadn't lied about me, they submitted as exhibits a lot of their own internal email exchanges about me, which to my amazement, a correspondence that had been going on for several years. I had no idea. I didn't think they knew or cared what I did, but it turns out that some of them were extremely hostile to what they thought I was doing in the classroom. All right. So as to that, we still wait for the judge in the case to rule on their motion to dismiss. And they filed it in February. So it's been a long wait. If he grants their motion, we will proceed with an appeal. If he denies their motion, we will proceed with a request for discovery so we can read more of what they had to say. And there's a GoFundMe page if anyone's interested in supporting this legal effort. Okay, now let's get back to the review of my conduct. I was flabbergasted that the dean granted the request without even talking to me. The provost here suggested that I speak to him, so I did. We had a brief meeting online. And in that meeting, he seemed a little bit disengaged. He told me, interestingly, I said, why did you grant this request, so readily, without talking to me? And he said that the university's lawyers had told him that he must, which I thought was significant, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that there's been some kind of encouragement of my colleagues from on high. That's simply a speculation, all right? Anyway, that's what he told me. And he told me the review would be finished in mid-December, that they would talk to students. And I said, may I have former students write to you in my defense? And he said, yes. Okay. So I proceeded to get former students and visitors to my classes to email him in my defense, and they got well over 50 emails in my defense, very, very precise and powerful and very moving support, for me. So mid-December came and went. I heard nothing. The spring semester, I was on medical leave. Actually collapsed. I mean, this really had a terrible effect on my health. I have Lyme disease. And I became so sick by mid-January that I had to go to the ER, and I was in the hospital for a few days. This is significant for a reason I'll reveal in a moment. Anyway, I was on medical leave. I heard nothing from the dean. The summer came. I heard nothing all summer. This semester came, and I heard nothing all semester until last Friday, when I received an invitation to meet with the dean to follow up on our prior conversation, which was over a year before, right? That was our prior conversation. So the news is, Elze, the news is that the dean told me at the top of the meeting, over his mask, because this was in person, that they had found that I had not violated any NYU policy. So I was cleared.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's a big win.
Well, it is a big win. It is a big win. Now, the interesting thing is that he then went on to express his grave concerns that a significant number of my students had in that review complained about having had a terrible experience in my classroom. They felt afraid of me. They felt they did not belong. They felt they could not be heard, and that I should therefore reconsider my teaching style and maybe even consider getting some coaching to teach me how to teach more effectively or less offensively, I suppose you could say. So I said, well, I'm always willing to improve, but I could do that if I had some more specific complaints to see precisely what I did wrong. And he refused. I asked several times, and he said that would be inappropriate or something like that. And I didn't have the presence of mind to ask what is a significant number of students? How many complaints are there, right? I emailed him yesterday to ask that question. I have yet to hear back. The point is, I think that's all face saving. I believe that the significant news here is indeed that they have cleared me. And that is a tacit way of distancing themselves from that attack on me by my colleagues. So it's very gratifying. It is actually something that strengthens my case. Whenever the judge, sees fit to render his decision, we'll proceed accordingly. But this does, and I thank you for letting me ramble on about it. This does exemplify something that's going on all over the world, has actually been going on for quite some time, but has reached the crisis point under COVID, right? What's most significant about my ordeal is that I as I often put it, I hit the censorship trifecta, okay? I was accused of putting people's lives at risk, okay? So that's the COVID code of proper speech or permitted speech. I was accused of assailing my students with non-evidence-based theories. That means conspiracy theory. So I was hit with that old cudgel, which has been used really since the late 60s in defense of the Warren Report, right? And anyone who questioned the official story of JFK's murder as a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
So they hit me with that. And then hate speech, that's cancel culture. I was hit with, you know, social justice cudgels, you know. So, and they managed to attack me with all three weapons, you know. So I don't know of anybody else who's been thus honored, you know, but I do think that, you know, to consider the upside for a moment, this does put me in a very good position to stand as a kind of champion for all those of us who have been muted, you know, gagged for various reasons, you know, because there's really no grounds for denying academic freedom, right, or free speech, unless you're actually actively inciting violence against others, you know, which if they could have found a way to suggest that I did that, they would have, I think.
But it's a hopeful message, because we also see so many lawsuits that where they bring in a lot of good evidence, and they are lost, like the Julian Assange lawsuit today.
Yes, I know, and I believe me, I don't labor under the delusion that I'm going to triumph ultimately. I may lose. NYU has a tremendous amount of influence on the bench in New York, because they have a very, very well-funded law school, and a lot of the people who are judges have actually lectured, you know, with, you know, hefty honoraria that are paid them by NYU, or they taught at NYU. You know, it's kind of the octopus in New York. And it has enormous real estate interests, about which I fought them very publicly for like 3 years, 6 or so years ago, because they've been pushing this grotesque real estate expansion here in Greenwich Village. I mean, I won't even go into it, but the fact is I took the lead. I organized the faculty resistance. We formed a nonprofit. We had fundraisers. We had celebrity support. We did a lot of propaganda of our own, you know, in the innocuous sense of propaganda. And I think we kind of won ultimately. We kind of won, but we did see that the courts basically bow when NYU tells them to bow, right? I was also a named plaintiff in a class action suit against NYU for mismanaging our retirement funds. And the judge's decision in that case was a flagrant example of conflict of interest, you know. You get these decisions that are based on no legal reasoning at all. They're just reflexive responses to tremendous institutional power. So, you know, I am ready to be defeated in court, but I actually don't think, whatever happens legally, that I will have been defeated, because I believe I stood up for the right thing, and more importantly, people all over the world who are in similar situations have felt
feel strengthened.
Yes, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Encouraged to speak out, and that's a victory. I mean, the truth, telling the truth is itself a victory. Whatever happens to you, you know.
Exactly. So going back to the propaganda, like, are there other ways to identify it, or did we hit the main points?
Well, we did hit the main points. We didn't really get into how subtle it can be, you know. It can be extraordinarily subtle. For example, you know, first of all, let me preface this by saying that if you have not studied the history of the CIA, for example, or intelligence agencies generally, especially throughout the West, and you don't know what they've done through the decades to destabilize other governments, you don't know about their involvement in, you know, innumerable assassinations and so on. You don't know about their propaganda work the world over. If you don't know any of that, as most educated people don't, because it's not taught in schools. There is no advantage in teaching it in schools. And of course, the media, having briefly begun to look into this in the mid-70s, briefly, otherwise blacks it out. They never talk about it, and you don't get it in the movies. You get it in some few movies. Some Roman Polanski's The Ghostwriter. You know, there are some movies that miraculously do come out that actually tell you some truth about intelligence agencies and what they've done. And another one I want to recommend, another movie, is Judas and the Black Messiah, which came out last year. It was nominated for an Oscar. And it was about the murder of Fred Hampton, the young Black Panther in Chicago in 1969. And it is completely accurate. And it makes abundantly clear that the FBI actually organized his murder by Chicago police. It's stunning that that movie was made and that it's so good. Okay. Anyway, I digress. If you don't know that history, then the kinds of things we're discussing are going to sound outlandish to you. That can't be true. What are you talking about? They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't deliberately harm us, you know, with injections that they know to be at best ineffective and highly toxic to boot. They wouldn't do that. Or that's connected to, they wouldn't fly planes into the towers and kill 3,000 people. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't kill a president in broad daylight. They wouldn't do that, right? Well, if you don't know about, say, Operation Northwoods, right, which was proposed to JFK by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the early 60s, which was a detailed plan for faking terrorist attacks by Cuba, like shooting down an airliner full of Americans. They actually proposed this in a memo to JFK in order to get him to sign off on it so they could create grounds for an invasion of Cuba. I mean, this wasn't something that they said, oh, this has never been done before. We know this is outrageous, but no, this is actually fairly standard operating procedure, this kind of false flag attack. So if you don't know any of this history, then you will be outraged to hear the suggestion that things like this are happening now, okay? So having said that, let me add that very often there are people out there who come at something like 9/11, say, from a really eccentric and offensive point of view, you know? Like I think that some of the people insisting that it was the Jews who were behind 9/11 and the Jews were warned and they didn't go to work that day. You know, these things are demonstrably false. But I do think that it is actually standard propaganda practice to deliberately support those kinds of voices, you know.
To create junk narratives.
Sorry?
To create junk narratives.
Exactly, to create junk narratives that will then give you something that you can lump together with legitimate counter narratives. See? Well, that, you know, I'm not going to look into 9/11 because everybody who is in 9/11 truth is an anti-Semite, you know? And that was very successful, actually, because, you know, a lot of American Jews, liberal Jews, wouldn't go near 9/11 truth, you know, for that reason, right? So the creation of junk narratives is directly related to the covert support of extremists or terrorists to, you know, commit despicable acts that create mass panic, that justify further crackdowns, that deepen mass division, because, you know, if anything, the empire wants us to be at each other's throats, you know? So when we understand these basics, we realize that propaganda includes, that the recent propaganda probably includes a lot of what happened after the murder of George Floyd, right? It certainly includes the so-called attempted coup on January 6th, which was demonstrably a psychological operation. I mean, it was theater. I mean, you could even see it in some of the videos, but it turns out the FBI was involved in that as well, right? Now, you talk to the hypnotized, Elze, you know, you talk to the blue meanies, right? You talk to people who get their information about everything from the New York Times and CNN and NPR. You can show them the evidence of FBI involvement. You can show it to them. they'll just get angry. In fact, in my experience, they become livid. They don't want to hear this, and they don't ever want you to talk to them again about anything. That's how strongly they feel about it, you know. So this stuff really does work because it hits people at a very, very deep level.
So yeah, so to break through it, somebody has to have a willingness first to look outside their own bubble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As I have done, as you have done, as a former sustainability consultant, you know, as we have to do. I mean, if your mind is not a dead thing, you know, if it's a functioning mind, it has to be open, right? Otherwise, it ossifies. It has to be open. And I, you know, the striking thing about this moment, and you've alluded to this too from your standpoint, is very similar to something quite striking about Germany in the 30s and through the war, is that the educated seem to be the most susceptible. You know, the better educated you are, the likelier it is that you will not view official claims with skepticism, whereas working people, you know, when we might say regular people, are much more skeptical and, you know, go along because they have to go along, but they don't really believe it, you know. I mean, I just reread Victor Klemperer's magnificent diary of, you know, he made it through the whole history of the Third Reich with his wife. He was Jewish, he's born Jewish, and he survived the war. They both did, and he kept this meticulous diary, which is just must reading, especially at this moment because it's oddly bracing, you know. He notes several times in the course of this epic diary that in his experience, the readiest vectors of anti-Semitic propaganda were educated people, you know, were the professional class. And it's the professional class that's guiltiest now of betraying humanity, as far as I'm concerned, because it is the professors, it is the academics, certainly is the doctors, and it certainly is the journalists. You know, those three professional classes have all failed to live up to their respective creeds. You know, mission. They failed to honor their respective missions and have completely caved in. And they should be leading the resistance to all this. But here we are. You know, you feel like an outsider. I know that I'm in a very small minority here at NYU, and I know other people at other universities who also feel sort of beset in this way. But it's very, very different from going, you know, outside the blue bubble and just mingling with regular people all over the place. And honestly, I think that the rising desperation of the of our overlords, that is, of those who are managing the propaganda spectacle, they become, the fact that they've become ever more strident and demanding and draconian, especially lately, is a sign, I think, that they are actually starting to lose. I don't think they can get any or many more people to get injected. You know, I think that once they set their sights on little children, you know, the backbone of the resistance kind of stiffened and the resistance grew. So, you know, I mean, this is another oblique answer to your question. If the tone of a propaganda drive becomes more sort of hysterical and bellicose, you know, and the attack becomes more ferocious. I mean, really, it was the same in Nazi Germany, you know, as they were starting to lose the war, the propaganda became more livid, you know, and the punishments more severe. I think we can probably argue that that change in tone is a sign of their desperation, which isn't necessarily good news, because I don't believe that the authors of this nightmare have any intention of quitting or losing. I think
they're in a catch-22 situation, I think. Like, they cannot stop now. What should they do? Like, so they have to go on. But the more draconian they get, the more bigger the resistance will get. So
That's right. I mean, let's face it. I know you agree because I'm on your list and you're on my list, and I share a lot of your stuff. So I think we're going to be in agreement when I say that the aim here is to radically reduce the numbers of global humanity and to exert a kind of mind control over the surviving remnant. I mean, we can't underestimate the radicalism of their intention, you know, that they really want to move into a kind of neo-feudal world order. They own all the land, and humankind is reduced to a servant class whose function is to look after them and take care of their needs. And it's global, you know, it's not just regional as it was in Hitler's case, it's actually global. And it will be heavily dependent on digital technology. Artificial intelligence will drive it. So it really couldn't be more dystopian. And contrary to the view of many I know who think that there is a genuine conflict between the West and China, I think they're in collusion. It's not hard to prove that the globalists regard China as the ideal society, as representing the model that they want the rest of the world to follow, where there will be no cash transactions. All transactions will be digital. They're shaping up to be based on carbon credits or whatever, you know. So it's going to be a social credit system that's wearing a green mantle, right? It'll be a green mantle to save the planet. And all too many people in the blue bubbles will believe that, right? But the fact is that the globalists only want to save the earth for themselves and think that the rest of us, by and large, are a kind of an offense to decency and common sense. They want most of us to be exterminated. That's what this is really all about. Just as Hitler's project was about extermination, so is this one. But the difference here is that they have succeeded in getting people to clamor for their own extermination, which is, you know, to step back for a moment and try to be objective about it, is really a staggering achievement. I mean, it really is remarkable that they could do that they don't have to, at least not yet in most places, they don't have to coerce people into getting injected, although that's probably coming. But they have got people elbowing each other out of the way, to dragging their kids to vaccination sites, putting masks on their children, you know. It's just so perverse, it just takes one's breath away. But that's what they have done, and they've done it through propaganda primarily.
So after the Second World War, of course, the war ended. And what happened? Because now I think we need to be liberated from within, because we won't get external armies that are going to liberate us. But what happened to those Germans who were like completely hypnotized those whole, say, 15 years, and then the war ended? Like, yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a very good question, and I can offer a fairly precise answer to it. I mean, the younger people in Germany came to recognize the gravity of what had happened, and this has to do with, you know, the way they taught the subject. Now, there's some argument over this, but the fact is that, at least in my experience, Germans, younger Germans especially, tend to be aware of what happened, although they're weirdly in denial about some things, you know, like the Reichstag fire. You know, the fact that the Nazis actually were behind the whole thing is, believe it or not, still controversial. It's a little bit like saying 9/11 was an inside job. Nevertheless, you know, that hypnosis was impossible to You couldn't hypnotize people born after the fact, right? Now, as to people who were hypnotized at the time, a lot of them just continued actually to believe the lies and just to kind of stay silent about them and to feel kind of resentful in the face of what had happened. And the most interesting book to read about that, and one that's oddly relevant to today, is, you may know it, it's called They Thought They Were Free. I think his name is Martin Meyer, who American, who went over to a particular town in Germany, you know, where they had burned down the synagogue on Kristallnacht and so on. And he just got to know a whole bunch of people who lived there. This was, I guess, in the 50s. And he interviewed them in depth and tells their stories really very sympathetically. You know, it's quite an achievement, that book. But it does make clear that the hypnosis can be lasting. You know, those who are not capable of a rude awakening, you know, in the face of a really destructive lie, they're kind of lost. You know, there's really nothing you can do. It's between them and God. You know, so as to the question of how we can be liberated from this, you've raised the most important question. I mean, back then it was possible for Germans persecuted or in hiding or in exile to look beyond Europe, right, to the United States or other parts of the world, where you could go to be free from what was happening in Eurasia, right? Similarly, with those living under Stalin, living under, you know, Soviet domination, that there was a world out there, and it used to be that the United States stood as the epicenter of that kind of resistance, or, you know, as the key alternative, right?
Yeah.
Well, all right, true enough. However, it was powerful American interests that actually promoted the whole eugenics agenda in the first place, that had a huge influence on Adolf Hitler as a young man. He read avidly in the literature of American eugenics, and that movement in the US, that movement in Germany, that movement in Britain, that movement was funded by the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Harrimans. Okay, these were American billionaires who you know, made their fortune. They were robber barons, and they pushed eugenics. They pushed it for a number of reasons. But the fact is that some of them, having then proceeded covertly to maintain the German war machine throughout the 40s, right? You know, Standard Oil and General Motors and Henry Ford and the rest of them, some of them should have been in the dock at Nuremberg along with the German perpetrators. They never were, you know, they got away. Well, it's really ultimately the same interests that, you know, having gone scot-free after that whole thing happened, their role utterly unrecognized, continued to push their eugenics agenda through the decades, you know. I mean, a very important documentary on this, on an aspect of this, a key aspect, which is to say the particular interest in exterminating Black people, is the subject of a documentary called Maafa 21. That's MAAFA 21. I just watched it last night because I did another podcast with Dr. Zelenko yesterday, and he told me about this, and I then watched it. I strongly recommend it. Okay. The fact is that those interests now are I think making their final attempt to secure permanent world domination. It is their final attempt really to monetize all nature and transcend nature. I think these people actually believe that they can live forever. I think that accounts for their interest in transhumanism, that they think they can kind of transition into a kind of immortality, you know, because they'll be cyborgs of some kind. It's really bizarre. But
well,
when
that's you read my newsletter. That's why I share a lot of these articles about these types of technologies, because if somebody tells you, you think this is so completely insane. Nobody would think of this, or this is just a weird science fiction movie for which nobody can get any funding. But you can just read the official reports, and there's enormous amount of research money going into this. Yeah, so, but sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's absolutely true. You do share some, key material on all this. It is not a fantasy. It's not a TV script. It's something that they really think about, and it also had a lot to do with Bill Gates's friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, who had a deep, sick interest in precisely this kind of eugenicist project. He wanted his seed to impregnate hundreds of women. This stuff is nuts, and it takes us back to movies like Chinatown, and Aguirre, Wrath of God. I mean, it used to be regarded as the epitome of insanity to harbor these kinds of thoughts, which kind of take us back to the Tower of Babel in the Bible, that this attempt to become gods, to remake nature, to change DNA, to change human nature. It is a totalitarian impulse, and one that's far more grandiose than those that drove Hitler's racial project or the Soviet project. This is much more ambitious, much more dangerous, much more perverse and unnatural, and that's really saying something, But the question you raise is the question that we have to answer. We can't answer it here today, the two of us, but we all have to think about it. Where will liberation come from, and what form will it take? Because this is global, This has taken us all completely by surprise. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that Australia and New Zealand would become the world's most oppressive countries? Who would have thought that, right? Some few people who take the long view might have suspected that something like this was in the works when the governments of both those countries succeeded in disarming their entire populations. Okay, this is the kind of speculation that I used to think only right-wingers would engage in. Now I realize, no, this is not a right-wing fantasy. I mean, China also makes gun ownership strictly illegal. Russia actually doesn't yet. China does, and Australia and New Zealand both had high-profile mass shootings followed by really, really successful confiscation drives. And now the people in those countries are completely helpless, and they're literally being housed in concentration camps, right? Or quarantines.
Hitler did the same thing.
Yeah.
He pushed for disarmament too.
Exactly. Well, that tells us something. Also, I want to note, as someone who always identified as being on the left, that one of the most eloquent defenders of gun rights was actually George Orwell, because in 1938 he wrote a newspaper article, one of the London papers. This was in the face of a possible Nazi invasion of Great Britain. He wrote a column affirming the importance of gun ownership by the general population. He said, I hope I have this right, that gun on the wall of the farmer's cottage or the working man's flat is a symbol of freedom. Okay, I believe that's how it ends, or maybe it nearly ends with that line. He was right. He understood. Look, governments must fear their people. They must. If governments don't fear their people, if they're not respectful of the popular will, right, they're gonna inevitably accrue way too much authority and turn authoritarian, which has happened now all over the world, all over the so-called democratic West. We have societies that are basically ruled by decree, by diktat. This whole thing is completely lawless, right? In 1984, at one point, Orwell notes that I think it may have had to do with Winston Smith keeping a diary, or going into the proletarian neighborhoods to ask questions and buy things and so on. Smith thinks to himself that this may be breaking a law, but there are no laws, so he couldn't actually be breaking any. That, you know, Oceania doesn't have any laws. It just creates this all-pervasive atmosphere of terror and brutally punishes or vaporizes people who step out of line. That's just what they do. So that's what we have now. That's what rule, under emergency conditions really means. And that has given rise to these petty tyrants of various kinds, you know, either government officials like Dr. Fauci, who essentially rules the United States, you know, through what we call Joe Biden, or governors of states, governors of provinces. The leaders of New Zealand and Australia are demonstrably insane, you know. But it's not based on anything legal or democratic. No laws were passed by any democratic body. That's where we are. So anyway, the question that we should have people considering as we wrap up is what will liberation entail? What will it look like? And most importantly, what does it require from me? You know, I mean, ultimately, it's our responsibility to
Yes.
seek our own liberation, right?
Yes, that's true. Because I think, yeah, a lot of people there still don't dare to speak out, or they don't see it as their personal, as something personal. It's happening outside them, but they're sleepwalking into a system that that I think if you realize what it is, because yeah, that's because the conversation is about how do you see through the propaganda, and something that I always try to balance, but I find difficult, is I kind of try to offer counter information, so the information you don't get in the mainstream news. But at the same time, I'm trying to identify what are the power structures, how are they operating. And you've talked about a lot of things that I discovered too, like the deep state level that's operating kind of parallel or behind the scenes, and how much influence it has. But for the people who are just awaking, that like the things that we were just discussing, that I can imagine they are looking at this and they think they're completely insane.
Right.
Like, what are they talking about? And I can, if you are coming from the corporate media, you've never listened to anything, you never really done your homework, then I can actually understand it. But it's difficult because on the one hand, you want to talk to people who start to understand what's happening and the scale of it. And on the other hand, you don't want to scare the people away who are just waking up. Yeah, so that's not really a question, but that's something also, yeah, when we are having this conversation, thinking about like how do you filter that? If we think about, we need a very big awakening. So yeah, how do we help people snap out of the hypnosis? Yeah.
Well, you put it very well. One has to walk a fine line in order, on the one hand, to maintain the possibility of getting people to come around, or come to, you know, and at the same time, you know, but to do so without driving them into a kind of self-protective denial, right? I
Yeah.
mean, all of the stuff about conspiracy theory, all of that is successful because it tells people what they want to hear. Naturally, nobody wants to think that the authorities are so malevolent. Nobody wants to think that Bill Gates is actually trying to exterminate the people he seems to be intent on helping. Nobody wants to think that the health authorities all over the world would consistently recommend against the very things that are likeliest to save people's lives. I mean, that's not incompetence. That's something else. Nobody wants to think that, okay? You'd have to be crazy to want to think that. So I sympathize with those who bridle when you make these claims or you say the kinds of things that you and I are saying. I understand that, you know, but at a certain point, there comes a moment when you have to say, look, you know, the crunch has come. This is serious.
Mm-hmm.
It's a matter of life and death, and it's a matter of your life. It's a matter of your
Mm-hmm.
children's lives. So, I mean, I can talk to you till I'm blue in the face, and you can tell yourself that I'm crazy. All right, all right. God be with you. Okay. Perhaps
Mm-hmm.
something will happen so that something will succeed in doing for you what I can't do for you. I don't know. But
So it's
yeah,
also the value of speaking the truth because it plants seeds.
well, that's right. Therefore, ultimately, the most important thing that one can do is to do the kind of thing we're doing. One
Mm-hmm.
needn't have a podcast to do it, or be, a professor somewhere. One
Mm-hmm.
can simply try to inform oneself and share what one has found with others day to day. Word of mouth is very, very effective.
Mm-hmm.
And you go on Facebook or Twitter, there are all these people who have become sort of self-created vectors of the big pharma Gates propaganda. They're just spouting it all. I have colleagues, highly educated people with advanced degrees who keep spouting this stuff from the New York Times, and NPR as if it's their own discovery, as if it's their own thought. And it has become their own thought, They're like the
Mm-hmm.
pods in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, But we have to keep telling the truth anyway, and we can do that no matter what our station is, no matter how visible we are. So,
Mm-hmm.
let's hope that you and I have helped to move that process along with our conversation here.
I hope so too. I think that's a good way to end and a good note to end the conversation on.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Okay.
Yes, pleasure was mine.
Okay.
Bye.